She stole $175,000 that my grandfather gifted me and used it to buy my sister a house next door. Then she told me I wouldn't understand investments. So I exposed her LLC fraud, forced her to sign the house over to me, sold it, and mailed a pathetic $150 check back without a word. I was 18 when everything finally detonated, but the truth is the fuse had been burning for years, quietly hissing the background of my life while everyone pretended not to hear it. My name is Ethan Walker, and if you ever asked my mother to describe me, she would pause just long enough to look patient and wounded before saying I was the difficult one. We lived in a quiet subdivision just outside Briarwood, Illinois, the kind of place where every lawn was trimmed to HOA-approved precision, every mailbox matched, and every family smiled the same tight smile during neighborhood barbecues. On the surface, everything about our life looked polished and respectable. My mom made sure of that. Linda Walker treated our home like a stage and herself like a public relations manager obsessed with image control. At church, she was all warmth and soft laughter, pressing folded bills into donation envelopes and volunteering for every food drive. She remembered birthdays, sent sympathy cards, and spoke in a tone that made people feel seen. Online, she curated our lives with the same precision, posting filtered family photos where the lighting always looked golden, and the captions talk about gratitude, blessings, and how proud she was of her children. In those pictures, Chloe stood front and center, glowing with achievement, while I hovered at the edge of the frame, smiling just enough to avoid another lecture later about looking ungrateful. At home, everything was measured in comparison to my younger sister. Chloe was 2 years younger than me, and somehow already everything I was not. She pulled straight A's without seeming to try, captained the varsity soccer team, and had teachers who talked about her like she was already destined for something Ivy League and untouchable. My mom said her name with a softness she never used for mine. Chloe's trophies had their own shelf in the living room, perfectly dusted, angled just enough to catch the light when guests walked in. When relatives visited, my mom would guide them over there within minutes, her hand hovering near the awards like a museum curator presenting a masterpiece. Me, I worked part-time at a hardware store on the edge of town, the kind of place that smelled like lumber and motor oil and fertilizer. I liked the weight of real work, the feeling of lifting something solid, and knowing exactly what it was meant for. After school, I would come home, change into old jeans, and disappear into the garage where I restored old engines. There was something calming about taking apart something broken and putting it back together piece by piece until it roared back to life. On weekends, I drove out to Oak Ridge County to help my grandfather, Frank Reynolds, mend fencing, repair tractors, and handle whatever the farm demanded that day. The land there stretched wide and open, nothing like the boxed-in perfection of our subdivision. With my grandfather, I felt useful instead of judged. To my mom, though, all of that translated into a single verdict: Ethan lacks ambition. She said the way other parents might say their kid needed glasses, like it was a minor defect that required correction. She would stand in the doorway of the garage, arms folded, watching me work on an engine with an expression that mixed disappointment and calculation. She talked about internships, business schools, networking, things that sounded like polished buzzwords pulled from a motivational podcast. She compared my grease-stained hands to Chloe's college prep binders, my paycheck from the hardware store to the scholarships Chloe was already being told she would earn. I learned early that arguing only fed the fire. If I defended myself, she would call me sensitive. If I stayed quiet, she would interpret it as proof that I had nothing worthwhile to say. So I chose the option that caused the least immediate damage. I kept my head down. I avoided confrontation. I made sure not to embarrass the family. That phrase was repeated so often it became background noise, like the hum of the refrigerator at night. Do not embarrass the family. Do not make us look bad. Do not fall short in public. At dinner, the dynamic played out in small, precise ways. My mom would ask Chloe about practice, about upcoming tests, about which colleges had sent brochures that week. When it was my turn, the questions felt like cross-examinations. Had I applied anywhere yet? Was I planning to do something more serious than fixing engines? Did I understand that life required more than manual labor? My answers were never quite right. If I said I was considering trade school, she would sigh. If I mentioned working full-time for a while to save money, she would remind me that serious people did not stall their futures. Chloe would sit there quietly, sometimes offer me a small sympathetic glance, but she never contradicted our mother. She was a golden daughter, and even she seemed to understand that challenging the narrative would only create fallout. The house itself felt divided in invisible lines. Chloe's room was a showcase of certificates and neatly arranged textbooks. Mine was simpler: a bed, a desk cluttered with mechanical manuals, a shelf of parts one was trying to salvage. When guests came over, my mom encouraged them to peek into Chloe's room to admire her discipline. Mine remained closed, as if it might expose something inconvenient. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself that success did not have to look like framed diplomas and social media captions. But over time, the constant comparison seeped in, quiet and corrosive. I started measuring myself the way she did, lining up my choices against Chloe's, and coming up short in a competition I never agreed to enter. Even when I was out at the farm with my grandfather, sweat on my back and dirt under my nails, there was a part of me bracing for the next comment, the next reminder that I was somehow misaligned with the version of a son my mother wanted to present to the world. By the time I turned 18, that quiet bracing had turned into something heavier, something tight in my chest that never really went away. From the outside, we were still the perfect family in a perfect subdivision, smiling under porch lights and posing for holiday photos. Inside, the roles were set in stone. Chloe was the proof that my mother had done everything right. I was the flaw she kept trying to polish away, without ever admitting that she might be sanding too hard. My 18th birthday fell on a Sunday, and my mom insisted on hosting what she called a small brunch, which in her language meant an event carefully curated to look effortless, while requiring me to play background staff in my own house. She woke me up early to move chairs from the garage and wipe down the patio furniture, because apparently a thin layer of pollen would have reflected poorly on her hosting skills. By the time guests started arriving, the dining table was covered in pastel plates, a fruit platter arranged in symmetrical spirals, and a quiche that she kept repositioning for better lighting near the window. Chloe stood beside her in a soft blue dress, smiling as my mom snapped photos for social media, adjusting angles, telling her to tilt her chin just slightly. I refilled coffee cups and carried out extra napkins while distant relatives and church friends patted my shoulder and told me adulthood was a big milestone. Grandpa Frank arrived later than everyone else, his old pickup rumbling down the street like it did not belong among the polished SUVs lining our driveway. I saw him through the window before anyone else did and stepped outside to meet him. He was leaning heavier than usual on his cane, moving slower, but his grip when he hugged me was still firm and steady. He smelled like leather and wind, and the faint trace of motor oil that never seemed to leave his skin. He handed me a plain white envelope with my name written in thick block letters across the front, the handwriting uneven but deliberate. He squeezed my shoulder once and told me he was proud of me in that quiet way he always had, without theatrics. I thanked him and slipped the envelope into the pocket of my hoodie, not wanting to open it in front of everyone and make it into a spectacle. Inside, the brunch moved along like a stage performance. My mom gave a small speech about how fast time flies and how proud she was of both her children, though she lingered longer on Chloe's accomplishments than on anything about me. I stood there smiling, nodding at the right moments, feeling more like a prop than the reason for the gathering. When most of the guests had settled into conversations about college applications and property taxes, I sat down at the table and finally pulled the envelope from my pocket. It felt light, just paper and maybe a check, nothing dramatic. I slid my finger under the flap and opened it carefully. Inside was a folded sheet of paper with my grandfather's familiar handwriting covering it, advice about working hard, staying honest, remembering where I came from. It was the same kind of note he had given me every birthday since I was old enough to read, practical and steady. Tucked behind it was a check made out in his name, written for $150. I stared at the number for a second, not disappointed, just mildly surprised because it was a little more than usual. I looked up at him across the table and said, "Thanks, Grandpa," loud enough for him to hear over the clinking of dishes. He did not smile back the way I expected. Instead, his forehead creased and he leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing in confusion. He asked me what check I was talking about, and for a second I thought he was joking. I held it up between my fingers and said the birthday check, $150, trying to keep my tone light. The air in the room shifted in a way that was almost physical, like a door had opened somewhere and let in a cold draft. He stared at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something between disbelief and concern. He said my name slowly, like he was grounding himself, and told me he had wired me $175,000 3 weeks earlier, directly into my savings account. He said it plainly, without drama, like he was mentioning the weather. For a moment, I did not understand the number. It sounded abstract, too large attached to anything real in my life. $175,000. The words echoed in my head, hollow and disorienting. I felt the air leave my lungs, as if someone had punched me in the chest. My heart started beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. I pulled my phone out of my pocket with hands that suddenly felt clumsy and opened my banking app right there at the table. The screen loaded, bright and indifferent, and displayed the same balance it showed me the night before, $612.43. I blinked at it, refreshed it, checked again. The number did not change. Across the table, my mother had frozen mid-sip of her coffee. The mug hovered just inches from her lips, her eyes fixed somewhere between me and my grandfather. The smile she had been wearing for the guests drained slowly from her face, replaced by something tighter, more calculating. Chloe, sitting beside her, looked back and forth between us, confusion written openly across her face. The low murmur conversation around the table faded as relatives began to sense that something was wrong, their forks pausing in midair. My grandfather did not look away from me. He said he had gone to the bank himself, that he had signed the transfer forms, that he had double-checked the account number I had written down for him months earlier when he mentioned wanting to help me get started after high school. His voice was steady, but there was an edge underneath it now, a current of suspicion threading through his words. He asked me if I had changed accounts. I told him no, that I only had the one savings account linked to my checking. My mouth felt dry as I spoke, each word scraping on the way out. I could feel every pair of eyes at the table shifting between us. My phone screen still glowed in my hand, the small, pathetic balance staring back at me. $612.43. I tried to reconcile that number with $175,000, and my mind simply refused to connect them. My mother slowly set her mug down on its saucer with a soft clink that sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. She smoothed her napkin on her lap, her posture straightening as if she were bracing for impact. In that moment, the carefully curated brunch, the pastel plates, the staged smiles, all of it felt like a thin layer of paint cracking under pressure. I sat there at the head of the table, my 18th birthday stretching out in front of me, and realized that whatever it just uncovered was bigger than misplaced check and far heavier than the envelope still lying open beside my plate. I checked my banking app twice, then a third time, as if the number might change out of embarrassment for being so small in the face of what had just been said, but the screen remained stubborn and flat, showing the same $612.43. No pending deposits, no large transfers, nothing that even hinted at mistake or delay. My hands felt cold despite the warm June air drifting in through the open patio door, and I could hear the faint buzz of conversation from relatives who were pretending not to listen while clearly listening to every word. My grandfather repeated himself, slower this time, explaining that he'd wired $175,000 directly into the savings account that had been set up years ago for my college fund, using the routing and account information my dad had provided him back then. He said he'd kept the confirmation paperwork in his truck because he did not trust online receipts, and there was a firmness in his voice that made it clear he was not confused, not mistaken, and not misremembering. The mention of my dad tightened something in my chest because he had always handled the numbers in our family, always been the one discussing interest rates and long-term planning in a tone that made everything sound responsible and secure. The account my grandfather was talking about had been open when I was a kid, presented to me as something solid and untouchable, a foundation for the future that would be there when I needed it. I had never questioned it, because I had never been given a reason to. Now, sitting at the table with my phone glowing uselessly in my hand, I felt the ground shift under that assumption. I turned to my mom directly, not skirting around it, not softening the words, and asked her if she knew anything about what Grandpa was describing. For a brief second, there was an opening where she could have looked surprised or concerned or confused. She did none of those things. She did not deny it. Instead, she inhaled slowly and set both of her hands on the table, fingers interlaced in front of her like she was about to lead a committee meeting rather than explain the disappearance of a life-changing sum of money. She said that yes, I was legally an adult now, and she acknowledged that with a small nod that felt rehearsed, but she followed it immediately by saying that legal adulthood did not automatically equal financial maturity. Her tone was calm, measured, almost instructional, as if she were explaining something obvious to someone who simply lacked the experience to understand it. She said that my father and she had moved the funds into what she described as a more strategic investment vehicle, something that would yield better long-term growth than leaving it sitting in a basic savings account. She spoke about diversification and risk management and protecting assets from impulsive decisions, and every word landed like a carefully polished stone. I felt my heartbeat in my throat as I repeated her statement back to her in the simplest possible terms, telling her that she had moved my money. She did not flinch at the directness. She did not look ashamed or defensive. She corrected my wording immediately, her eyebrows lifting slightly as if accuracy mattered more than impact. She said they had safeguarded it. The way she emphasized that word made it sound noble, protective, almost sacrificial, as if she had carried something heavy on my behalf. Around us, the table had gone completely silent. I could sense my grandfather's posture stiffening beside me, the quiet tension radiating from him like heat from asphalt. Chloe was staring at our mother, her expression no longer confused but unsettled, as though she was seeing a version of this conversation she had never witnessed before. My dad sat rigid in his chair, eyes fixed on the tablecloth, his jaw tight but his mouth closed. He did not contradict her. He did not elaborate. He let her words stand as the official narrative. Inside my head, the translation was brutally simple. She took it. Whether she dressed it up as strategy or protection did not change the reality that $175,000 meant for me had been moved without my knowledge, without my consent, and without any intention of telling me until it was convenient. The careful language, the polished tone, the absence of apology all made it clearer, not murkier. This was not an accident. This was not a banking error. This was a decision. I thought about the way she had stood in the garage doorway for years, critiquing my choices, questioning my ambition, framing me as someone who could not be trusted with his own future. I thought about every dinner conversation where my plans were dissected and found lacking, every comparison to Chloe's academic milestones, every subtle implication that I required supervision to avoid ruining my own life. In that moment, her explanation fit perfectly into that long pattern. Of course she believed she knew better. Of course she believed that giving me direct control over that money would be reckless. In her mind, she was not stealing. She was correcting. The problem was that she did not look sorry. There was no flicker of regret in her eyes, no softening of her expression when she saw the shock still written across my face. She looked composed, almost satisfied, as though she had successfully managed a potential crisis by reframing it. Her posture remained straight, her chin level, her voice steady. If anything, there was a trace of impatience underneath it all, as if my reaction was the only unpredictable variable in an otherwise well-executed plan. I sat there with my phone still in my hand, the useless banking app open, and felt something inside me settle into a cold, clear understanding. The brunch decorations, the stage photos, the speeches about pride and adulthood had all been built on a version of reality that did not include me having full ownership over my own life. I had been expected to smile, to nod, to accept that decisions about my future could be made without me because someone else believed they were more qualified to decide. The number 175,000 echoed in my head again, no longer abstract but sharp and defined, and the space between what was promised and what was actually there felt wider than the tables separating us. 2 weeks after my birthday, a bright red sold sign appeared in front of the house next door on Willow Crest Drive, staked firmly into manicured lawn like a flag marking territory. And I noticed that while pulling into our driveway after late shift at the hardware store, the sun dipping low enough to cast long shadows across the identical rows of houses. The place had been on the market for a couple of months. A 2-story colonial with pale siding and dark shutters, nothing flashy but solid. The kind of property that fit perfectly into my mother's vision of respectable suburban success. I remember standing there for a moment with my truck door open, staring at the sign and feeling a faint, uneasy recognition stirring in my chest, as the timing of it lined up too neatly with a number that had not stopped echoing in my head since that Sunday brunch. That evening, we sat down at dinner as usual, the table set with the same careful symmetry my mom always insisted on, and she waited until everyone had a plate before clearing her throat with a small, anticipatory smile. She announced that the house next door had been purchased, pausing just long enough to build suspense before revealing that we were the buyers. She said it proudly, like she had just closed a major corporate deal, and explained that it was an investment property, a strategic acquisition that would appreciate over time. My dad nodded beside her, offering no additional details, his expression neutral in the way it had been since the brunch. Chloe looked surprised at first, then intrigued, her eyes widening as she imagined whatever possibilities came with owning another house. I already knew the answer before I spoke, because the math had been running constantly in the back of my mind for 2 weeks straight, but I asked anyway, keeping my voice steady even though my pulse had quickened. I asked her with what money they had bought it. The room did not explode this time. There was no stunned silence like before. Instead, my mother's lips curved into a small, almost indulgent smile, the kind you give to someone who has just proven your point about their lack of understanding. She said I would not understand long-term asset growth, her tone calm and faintly amused, as if the concept was too sophisticated for me to grasp. She spoke about leveraging capital, about positioning the family for future security, about how property in our area was a safer bet than letting funds sit idle. She never mentioned the number directly, never acknowledged the source out loud, but she did not have to. The implication hung between us, heavy and undeniable. I felt something twist in my stomach as she described the purchase, as if it were a triumph of foresight rather than the redirection of money that had been wired specifically into my name. The house next door was not an abstract investment. It was a tangible structure with hardwood floors and a fenced backyard and a mortgage that could be partially offset by a large initial payment. I had looked up its listing price online the day the sold sign went up, unable to stop myself, and the figure had sat uncomfortably close to $175,000 when factoring in a sizable down payment. The numbers aligned too cleanly to be coincidence. Later that night, I was in the garage with the hood of an old pickup propped open, trying to focus on a rhythm of tightening bolts and checking connections, when the door burst open and Chloe rushed in, her face flushed with excitement. She rarely came into the garage unless she needed something, so the energy she brought with her felt foreign against the steady hum of tools and metal. She told me they were fixing the place up for her, her words tumbling over each other in a rush of enthusiasm, explaining that instead of living in cramped dorms when she started college, she would have her own space next door, close enough for convenience but independent enough to feel grown up. She said it like it was the best surprise anyone had ever planned for her, like the universe had aligned in her favor once again. As she talked, I pictured the new paint, the updated fixtures, the careful renovations that would make the place feel tailored to her, and I could see my mom overseeing every detail, ensuring it matched the aesthetic she curated so carefully online. Chloe's excitement was genuine, unfiltered, and I realized with dull clarity that she probably had no idea where the majority of that down payment had come from. To her, it was just another example of our parents believing in her future, investing in her comfort, smoothing the path ahead. She did not see the subtraction that had made it possible. The house bought with my grandfather's $175,000 stood 10 yards from my bedroom window, its porch light flicking on at dusk, its empty rooms waiting to be filled with furniture and framed certificates, and a quiet narrative that Chloe's success warranted this level of support. The symbolism was almost cruel in its proximity. I had grown up being told to keep my head down, to avoid embarrassing the family, to trust that the adults were making responsible decisions for my benefit. Now the physical evidence of those decisions loomed right next door, painted in fresh primer and justified with phrases about long-term growth. Standing there in the garage while Chloe described how she would decorate her future living room, I felt something inside me shift from confusion to something harder and more defined. It was not a loud explosion or a dramatic outburst. It was quieter than that, a cooling of something that had once hoped for fairness. The pattern was no longer subtle. The money meant to help me start my life had been transformed into a stepping stone for hers, reframed as strategy, wrapped in financial jargon, and presented as wisdom. In that moment, watching her smile about a house funded by a gift that had never truly reached me, I felt a part of myself lock into place, solid and unyielding, like metal finally tempered by heat. Something in me hardened, and I knew it would not soften easily again. Chloe's 17th birthday party took place at Lakeview Pavilion, a glass-front venue that overlooked the water and was usually reserved for weddings and corporate banquets. And from the moment we pulled into the parking lot, it was obvious that this was not just a party, but a production designed to be remembered and documented from every flattering angle. The entrance was framed with rendered floral arches in her favorite colors, soft blush and cream, and inside the main hall round tables were draped in linen that probably cost more than my entire birthday combined. There was a DJ booth set up near the dance floor with professional lighting rigs that washed the room in shifting colors, and a catering team moving efficiently between tables with trays of appetizers that looked too delicate to actually eat. A photographer with 2 cameras slung around his neck directed people into poses, adjusting shoulders and chins, capturing laughter on command. I stood near the back of the room during most of it, watching the spectacle unfold with a kind of detached clarity that had become familiar to me. My own 18th birthday had been 2 weeks before, celebrated at our kitchen table with waffles stacked unevenly on paper plates and a plastic bottle of syrup placed in the center like an afterthought. There had been no rented venue, no DJ, no catered spread. The decorations were a single pack of balloons taped crookedly to the wall, and the photos my mom posted online were cropped tightly enough to make it look more festive than it actually felt. At the time, I had told myself it did not matter, that I did not need extravagance to feel acknowledged. Standing in Lakeview Pavilion under professional lighting, that rationalization felt thin. The cake for Chloe's party was displayed on its own illuminated stand near the center of the room, a multi-tiered creation flown in from Chicago, according to my mom, who made sure to mention that detail to anyone within earshot. The frosting was smooth and flawless, decorated with sugar flowers so intricate they looked real, and Chloe beamed as guests gathered around to admire it before the candles were even lit. Every element of the evening seemed engineered to reinforce the same message. She was worth celebration on a grand scale. As the night went on, the DJ lowered the music and the lights dimmed for a slideshow projected onto a large screen near the dance floor. Chairs were turned toward it, conversations quieted, and the first image appeared with a soft fade-in effect. It was Chloe as a toddler in a tutu, grinning at the camera during her first dance recital. The next showed her in a tiny soccer uniform, knees scraped, trophy clutched proudly in both hands. Then came elementary school award ceremonies, family vacations where she stood in front of landmarks, middle school graduations, team photos, candid shots of her laughing with friends. The images flowed one after another, curated and polished, each one underscored by sentimental music chosen to tug at emotions. I watched carefully, not expecting to be the focus, but assuming I would appear somewhere in the background of our shared childhood, a brother standing beside his sister at Christmas, a face in a vacation snapshot, a blur in the corner of a birthday party from years ago. The slideshow moved through 17 years of her life with meticulous attention to detail, and I was not in a single frame. Not once did I flicker across the screen, not even accidentally. There were photos where I knew I had been present, events I clearly remembered attending. But somehow every image had been cropped, selected, or replaced in a way that erased me entirely. It was as if I had not existed in those moments at all. I felt the absence more sharply than I would have expected. It was not just about ego or wanting attention. It was about the quiet confirmation that the narrative of our family had been edited and I had been deemed unnecessary to include. Around me, guests dabbed at their eyes, smiling at how fast time flies, how beautiful Chloe's journey had been. My mom stood near the projector with her hand resting lightly on Chloe's shoulder, pride radiating from her like heat. My dad clapped when the final image faded to black and the lights came back up. I slipped out before the cake was cut, stepping through the side doors onto the patio that overlooked the lake. The air outside was cooler, carrying the faint scent of water and grass, and the music from inside thudded dully through the glass behind me. I walked down to the edge where the lights in the pavilion reflected in the dark surface, shimmering in distorted lines. I stared at my reflection in the water, the outline of my face broken by ripples each time a breeze passed over it. It hit me then that the ache I had been carrying for weeks was not just about the $175,000, not just about the house next door being renovated for Chloe, while I was told to trust in strategic investments. Those were tangible symbols, easy to point to and quantify. What cut deeper was a pattern of being minimized, trimmed out, adjusted until I fit only in the margins of the story my mother preferred to tell. The slideshow had not been an oversight. It had been curated with care, and my absence had required intention. Standing there by the water, watching my distorted reflection shift and reform, I understood that what I was feeling was not simple jealousy or resentment. It was a recognition of erasure, of being edited out of a family narrative that presented unity and pride to the outside world, while quietly sidelining me within it. The money was concrete, measurable, undeniable, but the absence on that screen had made something else unmistakably clear. It was not just that resources were distributed unevenly. It was that visibility, acknowledgement, and inclusion were too. And as the laughter and applause drifted out from the pavilion behind me, I realized that the hardest part to swallow was not the financial betrayal, but the realization that, in the story being projected for everyone to see, I had never been meant to stand in the frame at all. After Lakeview Pavilion, after the slideshow and the empty spaces where I should have been, I did not explode the way everyone probably expected me to sooner or later. I did not slam doors or scream or demand answers in the kitchen. While my mom tightened her mouth into that expression she wore when she wanted to look like the victim, I did not give her the satisfaction of calling me unstable or ungrateful or too emotional to be trusted with adult decisions. Instead, I went silent in a way that was new even for me. Not the old silence of survival where I swallow my feelings to keep the peace, but a deliberate, controlled quiet that gave me room to think. At home, I became careful with my face and my voice. When my mom talked about the renovation next door, I nodded once and kept eating. When Chloe bubbled about paint colors and furniture ideas, I gave her a thin smile and told her it sounded nice. When my dad avoided eye contact and pretended everything had returned to normal, I let him. The anger was still there, thick and hot, but I kept it contained, like a flame trapped behind glass. I had spent my whole life being told I was the problem, the difficult one, the kid who did not understand how the world worked. I decided that if they wanted to treat me like someone incapable of handling money or responsibility, then I would handle this like someone who understood the world better than they assumed. I started researching at night after my shifts, sitting in my room with my laptop open and the door locked, the glow of the screen reflecting off the same old posters I had hung as a kid. I did not scroll mindlessly or look for validation. I read. I read about property law in Illinois, about how gifts are treated legally, about what happens when money intended for one person is redirected by someone else. I looked up LLC structures and how people use them to separate assets from personal ownership, how a private LLC can buy property in a way that makes it harder to connect a purchase to a specific family's finances at first glance. I read about fiduciary duty, about guardianship, about the difference between managing someone's finances and taking them. I kept notes in a plain spiral notebook because writing things down made it real, made it organized, made it something I could hold in my hands. The more I learned, the less their explanations sounded like reasonable parental guidance, and the more they sounded like a script designed to suit outsiders who might ask uncomfortable questions. The phrases my mom used, safeguarded, strategic investment, long-term growth, were not magic words that transformed a transfer into something benevolent. They were cover. I kept circling one point over and over as I dug deeper. The money had been wired to me, for me, 3 weeks before my 18th birthday, and my grandfather had made it clear it was meant for my savings account, my future. When adults redirect funds clearly gifted to an adult beneficiary, without written authorization, and then use those funds to purchase property under a private LLC, it is not family management. It is misappropriation. It is taking something that does not belong to you and packaging it in respectable language. Once I had that word in my head, misappropriation, everything else fell into place with a cold kind of clarity. It did not matter how my mom smiled while she said I would not understand. It did not matter how she framed it as protection. The legal definitions did not care about her tone. They care about paper, records, authorization, intent. So I started gathering what paper I could. My grandfather met me out at his farm one afternoon, sitting at the worn wooden table in his kitchen while the smell of coffee and hay drifted in from the porch. He had brought the wire confirmation documents he kept in his truck, folded carefully in a manila envelope like they were deeds to land. He slid them across to me without ceremony, but his eyes stayed on my face, serious and steady. The printout showed the date, the amount, and the destination account information. Seeing it in black and white made my stomach tighten all over again because it removed any remaining space for denial. This was not a misunderstanding. This had happened. I pulled county filing records online, searching through public databases late at night while the house slept. I found a property listing history for the house next door, the sale date, the transfer documents. I traced the name of the purchasing entity, which was not my parents' names, but a bland LLC title that sounded like any generic investment group. The first time I saw it, my chest went tight with rage and satisfaction at the same time, because it confirmed what my instincts had been screaming since my mom's smug announcement. Then I dug further and located the LLC registration documents, the formation paperwork that listed the registered agent and the address tied to it. That address matched ours. The neat, little corporate veil my mom thought would protect her was thinner than she assumed. I took screenshots of my bank account balance, the same humiliating number sitting there like an insult, and I took more screenshots showing a lack of incoming transfers during the time frame my grandfather described. I saved them with dates and the file names, not because I needed them emotionally, but because documentation mattered. I scrolled through text messages with my mom and my dad, reading them with a new kind of attention, looking for what they had implied when they thought they were being careful. There were lines where my mom said they had repurposed the funds into something smarter, where my dad told me not to worry and to trust them, where Chloe mentioned renovations in a way that suggested she believed it was all part of some family plan. None of them said, "We took your money," but the implication pulsed underneath the words. I made copies of everything. Digital folders labeled by category. Printed packets in a binder I kept hidden under a loose floorboard in my closet. The kind of hiding place you expect from a kid trying to protect a secret. Except this time the secret was proof. When I felt like I had enough to stop guessing and start confirming, I drove to Rockford and met with a retired state attorney named Howard Klein, a man my grandfather knew through a friend of a friend. His office was small and quiet, with shelves of thick legal books that smelled like dust and paper, and framed certificates that looked earned rather than decorative. He was in his late 60s, with a tired face and sharp eyes, and he listened without interrupting while I laid out the timeline and slid the documents across his desk one by one. He did not react with the kind of shock I had seen on my relatives' faces. He reacted like someone who had seen people do terrible things while insisting they were doing them out of love. He read the wire confirmation, examined the LLC registration, glanced at the county filings, and then looked at me over his glasses with an expression that was neither pity nor surprise. He told me the word misappropriation was not dramatic in this context, that the structure they used suggested intent, and that people who do this rarely fear guilt because they have already justified it to themselves. He said what they fear is exposure, the moment their polished narrative cracks in front of the wrong audience. His words lodged in my mind and stayed there long after I left his office. After I drove back the flat Illinois roads toward Briarwood and watched the familiar subdivision appear in the distance like a set built for a show. They are not afraid of guilt. They are afraid of exposure. As I pulled into our driveway and saw the house next door with workers coming and going, paint supplies stacked on the porch, I felt that hardened part of me settle even deeper. Silence was no longer weakness. It was leverage, and I was building it piece by piece. 3 months after Chloe's party, my grandfather's health began to decline in a way that no one could dismiss as temporary fatigue or stubborn aging, and the shift was visible even in the way he held himself when I visited the farm, his steps slower across the gravel driveway, his breathing heavier after walking the fence line we used to repair side by side. The strength in his hands was still there, but it trembled sometimes when he reached for his coffee mug. And for the first time in my life, I saw something like urgency in his eyes, not fear exactly, but awareness that time was no longer something to assume. He did not waste it. Before anything worsened, before hospital rooms and paperwork could blur into chaos, he revised his will. He called me out to Oak Ridge County on a gray afternoon and sat me down at the same wooden kitchen table where we had reviewed the wire confirmation months earlier. A local attorney had already come and gone, leaving behind neatly organized documents in a leather folder. My grandfather explained it plainly, without drama or sentimentality, the way he always approached important decisions. He had transferred his 40-acre farm into a trust, and that trust was in my name. The land I had worked on since I was a kid, the fences I had mended, the tractors I had repaired, the soil I knew better than the layout of my own bedroom, was legally secured so that it would not pass through anyone else's hands first. It would not be redirected, repurposed, or managed on my behalf. It would be mine. He also added a notarized statement, separate and explicit, confirming that the $175,000 wired earlier that year had been a personal, unconditional gift to me, intended solely for my benefit, with no restrictions, no shared ownership, and no authorization for third-party management. The language was clear and formal, stripped of family softness, designed to stand on its own in any room where feelings no longer mattered. When I held that document, stamped and signed, I felt the weight of something far more powerful than anger. I felt insulation. Word traveled faster than I expected. My mother found out within days, and for the first time in my life, I saw her lose composure in a way that was not calculated or strategic. She did not deliver a measured speech about long-term growth or financial prudence. She did not smile with patient superiority. Her voice cracked when she confronted me in the kitchen, her hands shaking not with sadness but with fury. She accused my grandfather of being manipulated, of not understanding what he was signing, of making emotional decisions that would fracture the family. She spoke rapidly, tripping over her own words, and for once there was no polished filter smoothing the edges. I stood there and let her speak, not interrupting, not raising my voice, because I no longer needed to argue about interpretations. The documents existed. The trust existed. The notarized statement existed. They were not dependent on her approval. Soon after, a county compliance officer contacted my parents regarding discrepancies in the funding source of the LLC that had purchased the Willow Crest property. I did not orchestrate the tone of that call, and I did not need to exaggerate anything. Records speak clearly when lined up correctly. The officer requested clarification on the origin of the capital used for the down payment and supporting documentation verifying lawful transfer and ownership. When financial flows and registered entities intersect in ways that do not align cleanly, they attract attention, especially when the paper trail includes a gift formally assigned to someone else. My parents called me that evening, not together at first, but separately, each conversation layered with anger sharpened by fear. My mom's voice was tight and vibrating when she told me I was destroying this family, that I was inviting scrutiny that could damage reputations and create consequences far beyond what I understood. My dad echoed the sentiment in quieter tones, suggesting that this could have been handled privately, that legal involvement was unnecessary and extreme. Their words carried accusation, but underneath it I heard something else for the first time: uncertainty. I told them calmly that I was not the one who had redirected money, formed an LLC, and purchased property under a structure that concealed its true source. I told them that I had not created a discrepancy, only documented it. When my mother repeated that I was tearing us apart, I answered with steadiness that surprised even me, saying that I had not destroyed anything, that the fracture occurred a moment they decided my name on a bank transfer did not mean what it legally did. The silence on the other end of the line was heavier than any shouting match we had ever had. Mediation followed, held in a neutral office with beige walls and a long table that felt more like a conference room in a courtroom, but carried the same undercurrent of consequence. My grandfather's notarized statement sat in a folder alongside the wire confirmation, the LLC registration documents, the county filings, the screenshots of my account, and the text messages implying funds had been repurposed. The county inquiry hovered in the background like a ticking clock. Not yet an audit, but close enough to make the risk tangible. Exposure was no longer theoretical. My parents arrived composed but strained, their usual unity edged with tension. The mediator laid out the facts methodically, and when the possibility of formal legal escalation and expanded financial review was mentioned, I watched my mother's posture stiffen. The narrative she had built for years depended on control and perception. An audit did not care about perception. It cared about origin, authorization, and intent. Faced with evidence that was difficult to reinterpret and the prospect of deeper scrutiny that could ripple beyond a single property, they made a calculation. The Willow Crest house, the investment property framed as strategic genius, became negotiable. The agreement reached was direct. Full ownership of property would be transferred to me, title amended, control relinquished, in exchange for avoiding further legal escalation and limiting additional inquiry. It was not presented as an apology. It was framed as resolution. When they signed the transfer documents, the act felt both surreal and grounded. The same hands that had once moved money, without telling me now moved a pen across paper in a room where documentation mattered more than authority. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I watched carefully, absorbing the reality that something fundamental had shifted. I walked out of that building with copies of signed documents in my folder, and the knowledge that I legally owned the house on Willow Crest Drive. The same house that had been announced as an investment, renovated as a gift from my sister, justified as a lesson in long-term growth, now belonged to me outright. The irony was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet and solid, like a foundation settling into place. When I pulled into our driveway that evening and looked at the house next door, freshly painted and landscaped, it no longer felt like a symbol of what had been taken from me. It was an asset with my name attached to it, secured not by someone else's protection but by my own insistence on clarity. The reckoning had not been explosive. It had been methodical, and as I stood there in the fading light, keys in my pocket, I understood that ownership meant more than property. It meant that for the first time in my life, the narrative had shifted in a way they could not edit out. I listed the Willow Crest house for sale almost immediately after the transfer finalized, not out of spite or impulse but out of clarity, because keeping it would have meant living inside a monument to a narrative I had already rejected. The ink on the ownership documents was barely dry when I contacted a realtor and authorized a listing, and within days a clean white for sale sign stood on the same patch of lawn where the sold sign had once announced my parents' quiet triumph. The symmetry was not lost on me. I did not consult Chloe, and I did not warn my parents. Because the house was legally mine and for the first time in my life, I did not feel obligated to soften a decision that directly affected me. Chloe found out the way neighbors always find out, by driving past and seeing the sign staked in the grass, bold letters impossible to ignore. She came into the driveway later that afternoon with her eyes red and her voice shaking, demanding to know if it was true, if I was really selling it, if everything our parents had planned for her was just being erased. She called it betrayal, her voice cracking on the word, as if I had taken something sacred from her rather than reclaiming something that had been taken from me first. I listened to her, to the disbelief and hurt tangled together, and I understood that from her perspective this looked like cruelty. She had been promised something and had built her expectations around it. But promises built on someone else's loss are not solid ground. I told her calmly that it was not betrayal. I told her it was restitution. The word sounded clinical even to my own ears, but it fit. I did not raise my voice or argue about fairness. I simply stated that the house had been purchased with money that was never intended to fund her convenience, and that correcting that did not make me the villain in a story that had begun long before she knew the details. She cried harder when I said that, and for a moment I felt the old instinct to step back, to apologize just to restore peace. But I did not. Peace built on my silence was no longer acceptable to me. The house sold faster than anyone expected, partly because of the renovations already completed, and partly because our neighborhood rarely had inventory available. The final sale price was $232,000, a number that felt surreal when it appeared on the closing statement. Not because it was extravagant, but because it represented something reclaimed and multiplied. After fees and taxes were settled, I reinvested most of the proceeds directly into the farm in Oak Ridge County. I funded the construction of a greenhouse large enough to extend our growing season, installed irrigation systems that reduce water waste, and purchased specialized tools and lifts to expand the equipment restoration work I had been doing in the garage for years. What had once been a side effort became formalized under a new entity I registered myself, Walker Agricultural Restoration, LLC, structured cleanly and transparently, with documentation I understood line by line. Building something under my own name felt different than inheriting or reclaiming property. It felt deliberate. I worked longer days, balancing restoration projects with improvements to the land, turning unused sections of acreage into productive space. The greenhouse filled with seedlings that would not have survived early frost before, and clients began bringing in tractors and farm equipment from neighboring counties. Once word spread that I specialized in detailed restoration rather than quick patch jobs. The business grew steadily, not explosively, but solidly enough that each invoice and contract reinforced a quiet truth. I was not financially immature. I was capable. I simply needed control over my own direction. 6 months later, on my 19th birthday, an envelope arrived in the mail with my mother's handwriting on the front, precise and controlled as always. I opened it at the kitchen table on the farm while my grandfather drank coffee across from me. Inside was a birthday card with a generic message about wishing me success and happiness, and tucked into it was a check for $150. The amount did not surprise me. The symmetry was almost too perfect, a small echo of the first envelope I had opened months earlier at that brunch table. There was no apology written in the margins, no acknowledgement of what happened. Only a surface-level gesture that could be photographed and posted if needed. I looked at the check for a long moment before sliding it back into the envelope. I did not feel rage when I held it. I did not feel satisfaction either. What I felt was distance. I mailed it back the next day without a note, without commentary, without explanation. The act did not require words. It was a boundary expressed through absence rather than confrontation. I do not hate my parents. Hatred would tie me to them in a way I no longer want. What I feel instead is separation, a clear line between their version of reality and the one I inhabit now. In their version, control equal protection and image equal truth. In mine, ownership means accountability and transparency matters more than optics. I no longer belong to the narrative where my role is to accept decisions made for me and smile in family photos cropped to fit a preferred storyline. Some evenings, after the work is done and the tools are put away, my grandfather sits on the porch overlooking the fields, his cane resting against the railing, the skies stretching wide and open above us. The light settles over the rows of crops, and the greenhouse panels reflect the sunset in soft gold. He does not talk about legal documents or property transfers. He talked about the soil, about timing, about patience. Sometimes he simply looks at the land and nods once, as if confirming something to himself. He tells me he is proud, not in a loud or theatrical way, but in the steady tone of a man who recognizes effort and integrity. That pride carries weight that cannot be quantified on a bank statement. The $175,000 was significant, transformative even, but what it ultimately revealed was more valuable than the sum itself. It revealed where I stood, what I would tolerate, and who I was willing to become when tested. As the sun dips below the horizon and the fields settle into evening quiet, I understand that the worth of those lessons exceeds any wire transfer or sale price. And when my grandfather says he is proud, I know that affirmation, earned without performance or comparison, is worth more than the money ever was.